Evelyn had always been drawn to the strange and the mysterious. It was the reason she became an antique appraiser, why she found solace in things others found trivial. It wasn't the objects themselves that fascinated her, but the stories they carried. Stories of lives lived and forgotten, of spirits that lingered in the corners of time. But when the lantern arrived at her shop, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this was not a mere relic. It had a story to tell, and it wasn't going to be told easily. The lantern was old, no doubt about it. Its brass frame was tarnished with age, and the glass was smudged with what seemed to be years of soot. There was something strange about it, though. A soft glow emanated from the lantern even when the wick was unlit, casting a faint light on the table where it sat. Evelyn inspected it closely. "I've never seen anything like it," she muttered to herself. "What are you hiding?" The shop's bell jingled, and Evelyn glanced up to see a man standing at the door. He was tall, thin, with a sharp face that seemed to be made of angles. His clothes were old-fashioned, as though he'd stepped out of another era. His eyes locked onto the lantern the moment he entered. "You have it," he said, his voice low and measured. Evelyn froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. "Excuse me." The man stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the lantern. "The haunted lantern," he whispered. "I've been looking for it for years." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the town knew the legends about the lantern, about how it was said to be cursed, but she had dismissed them as just stories. Nothing more than folklore. The man's eyes were pleading now, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the lantern. "Please," he begged, "I must take it." Evelyn hesitated. She had never sold anything so rare, so unsettling. But there was something in his voice, something desperate that made her want to believe him. "I can't," she said softly, pulling the lantern away from his reach. "I don't know what it is, but it's not just any artifact. There's something wrong with it." The man's expression hardened. "You don't understand," he said. "It was never meant to be forgotten. It was meant to be a guide." "Guide?" Evelyn asked, her voice faltering. The man stepped back, his face pale. "To the lost souls," he murmured, his voice tinged with sorrow. "To those who never found their way out, the lantern, it brings them back." Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had heard the stories of hauntings, of restless spirits, but she never truly believed them. Now, as the soft glow from the lantern flickered eerily in the dim room, she wasn't so sure. Something was alive in the air, something ancient and otherworldly. "I need to know more," Evelyn said, her curiosity overpowering her fear. The man nodded grimly. "I will return tonight," he said, his eyes dark with a secret burden. "Then you will understand." As he turned and left, the lantern continued to glow, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Evelyn's fingers hovered over it, her mind racing with questions. What was it about this lantern? And why had it chosen to appear now? That night, as the clock struck midnight, Evelyn found herself unable to sleep. She had prepared her shop, leaving the lantern on the counter where it could easily be seen. The soft light flickered as though it beckoned her, urging her to uncover its secrets. She couldn't resist any longer. Evelyn approached the lantern slowly, her breath shallow. As her fingers brushed the cold metal, a sharp pain shot through her palm, and she gasped in surprise. The glow of the lantern intensified, bathing the room in a golden light that seemed to stretch out like fingers, reaching for her. A voice, soft and distant, filled the room. "You've awakened me." Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. It was not the voice of the man who had come earlier, but something older, more familiar. It was as though the very air around her had taken on a life of its own. Evelyn's hand jerked away from the lantern as if it had burned her. The voice continued to whisper, growing stronger, more insistent. It wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. There was no source. It was simply all around her, the sound of something trapped in the ether, desperate to be heard. "You've awakened me," it repeated. And this time Evelyn recognized the tone. It was sorrowful, but there was something more. Something ancient, like the murmur of the earth itself, forgotten by time. Evelyn took a step back, her legs shaking. She was no longer sure if she was imagining this, or if something real, something terrible, was happening in front of her. The room felt colder, as if the air itself had turned dense with shadows. The lantern's glow flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The voice didn't stop. "I have been waiting," it whispered, "for the one who dares to see, for the one who dares to listen." "Who are you?" Evelyn breathed, her voice trembling. She wanted to run, to shut the shop, to pretend this was all just a nightmare. But there was something in the air that held her in place, something that bound her to that lantern as surely as any chain. "I am the keeper of the forgotten," the voice responded, softer now but no less terrifying. "I am the one who keeps their souls from fading into oblivion. I light their way until they are remembered." Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest. "What do you want with me?" she whispered. The voice was quiet for a moment, as if considering her question. Then it spoke again, its tone deepening, laden with sorrow. "I need your help. You have the lantern. You have the power to remember." Evelyn shook her head, confusion swirling in her mind. "I don't understand. I'm just a keeper of objects." The voice interrupted, its tone gentle but firm. "You keep things that others have forgotten. But you're not simply a keeper. You're a listener, and I need you to listen." A heavy silence settled over the room. Evelyn couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare at the lantern, her pulse racing on as the shadows seemed to close in around her. The voice continued, "I have been trapped for centuries, bound to this lantern. I was once a guide, a protector, a guardian of those lost in the dark. But something went wrong. The souls I was meant to help, they were abandoned, left to wander without their way. And so I was left with them, bound to this cursed object, forced to watch them forever." Evelyn swallowed, her mouth dry. "And you want me to help you free them?" The voice didn't respond immediately. Then after a long pause it said, "Not just free them. You must remember them. You must make their names known again. Only then can they find peace." Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to make sense of the impossible. How could she remember these souls? How could she make their names known? She was just one person. What could she do? She opened her eyes again, and as she looked at the lantern, something changed. The shadows in the room seemed to pull back, revealing the edges of faded faces etched into the glass. At first, they were indistinct, like faces blurred by time. But as the light from the lantern brightened, they became clearer, sharper. Names began to emerge, floating in front of her like whispers in the dark. Evelyn gasped, reading them aloud without realizing she was doing so. Margaret Gray, Thomas Reed, Alice Davenport. The names continued to appear, each one heavier than the last, each one filling her mind with an overwhelming sense of loss. These were the forgotten, the lost souls whose stories had been buried by time. They were reaching out to her, not with words, but with their names. She could feel their longing. She could feel their pain. And she knew that the lantern was not simply an object. It was a prison, a cage for souls who had no other way to escape, no other way to be remembered. Evelyn's voice trembled as she asked, "What do I do now?" The lantern's light flickered once more, and the voice answered, "Remember, speak their names, set them free." The room seemed to darken once again as Evelyn looked at the lantern, now pulsing with an eerie rhythm. Something deep inside her told her that this was only the beginning, and the longer she stood there, the more the lantern's glow seemed to pull her in, urging her to release the souls it held. Evelyn stared at the lantern in her hands, the names still swimming in the glass, each one clearer than the last. The soft whispers of the souls filled her ears, their voices like a low hum in the back of her mind. She knew what she had to do, but every inch of her felt reluctant, like stepping into a dark, unfamiliar room with no way to turn back. She had awakened something that shouldn't have been disturbed, and now she could feel its weight pressing on her shoulders, suffocating her with its urgency. The room was silent now, except for the rhythmic thumping of her heartbeat in her ears. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, but deep down, she knew she didn't have a choice. "Remember us," a voice said, so close she could feel it brush against her ear. It was a soft plea, a sound so haunting it made her skin crawl. She opened her eyes, and in the dim light of the lantern, she saw the faces again, clearer this time, their eyes full of desperation, their mouths moving silently as they reached for her. They were waiting for her. They needed her to do what no one else had done in centuries. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand trembling as she touched the lantern once more. The glass felt cold, like the touch of 1,000 hands, all clamoring for attention. A heavy weight settled on her chest as she opened her mouth to speak the first name. "Margaret Gray." The moment the name left her lips, the room seemed to grow colder. The faces in the lantern's glass shifted, as if they were reacting to her words. The soft glow intensified, flickering violently as though struggling to break free from something. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine, but she pressed on. "Thomas Reed." With each name she spoke, the air thickened, pressing in from all sides. The lantern's light flared brighter, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose, as if the souls were rising. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of what she was doing dawning on her. Each name was another step further into the unknown. But the lantern beckoned her, and she could feel it pulling at her, urging her to continue. Alice Davenport. As soon as the name left her lips, the room seemed to tremble. A sound, distant, faint, began to echo through the shop. It was a low wail, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. The lantern's glow flickered again, and Evelyn felt an unsettling shift in the air. The souls she had called were no longer mere names in the glass. They were here, with her. Her pulse quickened, and she stepped back, her eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The shadows around her seemed to move with a life of their own, stretching toward her, reaching out with claw-like hands, but there was no turning back. She had called them. Now she had to see it through. Elizabeth Ward. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the lantern glowing brighter than ever before. The shadows morphed into shapes, into figures, faint at first, but then growing clearer. They were the lost souls, the ones who had been forgotten, abandoned. And they were angry. Evelyn felt the temperature drop as the figures in the shadows began to take form. They were no longer just faces in the glass. They were real, their features twisted with pain, their eyes hollow and searching. And they were reaching for her. "No," Evelyn whispered, taking a step back. "I didn't mean to." The voice in the lantern interrupted her. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And now they're free. But freedom comes at a cost." Evelyn's heart raced, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. The room was no longer her shop. It was a graveyard. A place where the dead roamed and sought retribution for the years of silence they had endured. The figures, the souls she had freed, were closing in. Their eyes locked onto her, their faces contorted in silent screams, their mouths opening wide as if to swallow her whole. Evelyn could feel the weight of their presence, their anger, their hunger. "You've awakened them," the voice from the lantern said, its tone now filled with bitterness. "Now you must carry their burden." Evelyn backed into a corner, her hands shaking as she clutched the lantern. The souls were all around her now, their forms ever shifting, stretching toward her with impossible speed. They were no longer asking to be remembered. They were demanding it, and their demand came with a price. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows pressed in around her, each figure reaching for her with outstretched arms. Their eyes, hollow and desperate, locked onto her, their presence suffocating, each soul hungry for release. She could hear their whispers now, frantic and incoherent, voices clamoring together in a cacophony of anguish and rage. She had called them. She had awakened them. And now, they wanted something in return. "You cannot escape," the voice from the lantern echoed, its tone sharp and unforgiving. "They are here because of you, and they will stay until their story is complete." Evelyn's mind raced. She had never asked for this, never asked for the weight of these souls, their memories, their unfinished lives. She had simply stumbled across an ancient object that held far more power than she had realized. And now she was trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by the very things she had tried to avoid. The remnants of the past, seeking justice for their forgotten lives. "Please," she whispered, clutching the lantern tighter, its cold metal pressing into her palms. "I never meant to." "Too late," the voice interrupted. "You have listened to their names. You have breathed life into their pain. And now you must bear their burden, just as I have borne mine for centuries." The shadows around her writhed and twisted, their forms becoming more distinct with every passing second. Evelyn could see their faces now, each one twisted in eternal sorrow, each one bearing the mark of their tragic fate. There was Margaret Gray, her face gaunt with age, her eyes hollow from years of grief. Thomas Reed, his expression contorted in silent rage, his hand outstretched as if pleading for something he could never have. And Alice Davenport, her lips parted in a scream that was never heard. They had all lived once. They had all mattered. But they had been forgotten. And now they were here, demanding to be remembered. "You must remember them all," the voice said. "You must make their names known. Only then will they be free." Evelyn's head throbbed as she tried to process what was happening. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and her pulse hammered in her ears. She felt as if she were drowning in their grief, in the weight of their existence. They were no longer just names. They were real. They were here, and they were reaching for her with open, desperate arms. But there was something in the back of her mind, something buried deep within the lantern, that told her there was a way out, a way to end this. She had to find it. She had to find a way to give these souls the peace they craved without losing herself in the process. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for something, anything, that could break the cycle. She needed to act fast. The souls were closing in on her, their hands almost touching her skin, their eyes full of despair and hunger. And then she saw it. A faint glow in the corner of the room. The lantern. Without thinking, she stumbled toward it, the souls following closely behind. The glow from the lantern pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, its light growing brighter, warmer, as if it were alive. She held it out in front of her, as though to ward off the souls, but the light did not push them back. Instead, it seemed to call to them, pulling them in, drawing them closer. Evelyn understood now. The lantern was not just a prison. It was a conduit, a way to guide the lost souls to the next stage of their journey. But in order to release them, she had to let go of her own fear. She had to face the darkness head on. Her voice trembled as she spoke the words. "I remember you, all of you, Margaret, Thomas, Alice. I remember your names. I remember your lives." The words felt heavy on her tongue, like a weight being lifted from her chest. As she spoke their names, the figures in the shadows began to fade, their forms becoming less solid, their faces softer, as if they were being washed away by the light. The tension in the room began to lift, the air growing lighter, less oppressive, and then the last name left her lips. Elizabeth Ward. The final soul, the last figure, seemed to shudder as it was pulled into the light of the lantern. Evelyn felt a sudden rush of energy, a surge of warmth flooding through her, as if the souls had been released at last. The shadows receded, and the oppressive weight lifted entirely. She stood alone in the room, the lantern now glowing gently in her hands, its light soft and peaceful. For the first time since she had found the lantern, Evelyn felt a sense of peace wash over her. The souls were gone. The weight had been lifted. But she knew, deep down, that the lantern's work was far from over. It would call again. It would always call to someone. But that would be someone else's burden, not hers. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had done it. The souls were free, and the haunted lantern was finally at rest.